In this video, we're going to be discussing the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehudah Loew of Prague. He was born at approximately the year 1512 to some people say up to the year 1526, and passed away in the year 1609. He was a descendant of King David through the lineage of Rashi. He writes the entire lineage. He was born in the city of Posen. His father's name was Bezalel, who was a scholar in his own right. There's an interesting story about his birth. He was born on the night of Passover, meaning during the Seder, and apparently, in that time, something which the Maharal later becomes famous for is his fighting of the blood libel, that Jewish people were using dead Gentile children for their matzah and Passover. And somebody apparently had killed a child and was trying to make this claim, and he heard footsteps chasing him on the night of Passover, and he ends up running and dumping the body and being caught because of this, because of his plans were interrupted. But actually the people running were going to bring a midwife to so the Maharal could be born. So his birth itself saved his entire Jewish community in the city of Posen. The name Loew his surname seems to come from the fact that Yehudah, which was his name, in the Bible is compared to a lion. So the Loew apparently is some sort of German word for lion. So that's where or Low, depending on how you pronounce it, Loew. So that's where that name comes from. He was engaged to be married to the daughter Pearl. This girl Pearl, the daughter of the Reich family, extremely wealthy family. He was given many promises about support and dowry, etc. He was only at the age of 10. I think she was maybe 6, but they obviously were not getting married then. And he goes off to study in yeshiva. He studies in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yaakov Polak in Poland. He studies with the great luminaries of that generation, who were then young students, the Maharshal, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, and the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, which we covered in a previous video, the great halachic codifier. Eventually, we'll talk about his marriage in a moment. He is invited to serve as the rabbi in the city of Nikolsburg, later, of course, in Prague, where he becomes famous as the Maharal of Prague. And, of course, later in his life, he becomes the chief rabbi, apparently, of Poland in the city of Poznan. And at the end of his life, he does return to Prague, and that's where he passes away, and that's where he is buried until this day. And I believe there's even a statue of him in Prague to this day. His wife, Pearl, was a tremendous Torah scholar. And he was, after this engagement, he was requested to come back to when he was about 14, maybe, I think she was 14 years old, and they said, okay, let's do this, let's get this wedding on. And he felt that she was too young. So they had a little bit of a disagreement. They meet, and he realizes how great of a Torah scholar she is in her own right, which in those days were extremely rare. There were no yeshivas for women. There were no seminaries for women like there is today. But somehow she had picked up on Torah scholarship. He gives her a regimen of study, and he says, okay, we'll come back. She agrees to him going on for another 4 or 5 years. Eventually, they do marry, and they studied Torah together. Every day they would study halachic works and Talmud, and which is just a tremendous thing in those days. Something that would later be developed, obviously, by his descendants, would be inspired by this. Maybe we'll talk about another time that his descendants were inspired by this and started teaching women Torah more and more, until today we have full on Jewish schools for women, and of course Jewish seminaries where women could study Torah in depth. Let's talk a little bit about his thought. He, of course, studied Kabbalah. We don't know if he had any specific tradition, but in those days, Kabbalah was studied together with Jewish law. It was not considered something like, forbidden or anything like that, like it was in a couple hundred years later. But essentially, he studied Kabbalah. It's very clear and obvious that he did, and we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. One of his things that he'd like to, his sefer, I believe it's called Ber HaGola, he defends the Medrash. And he essentially, at those times, there were many people who wanted to say that midrashic style Torah, so whether that was the medrash that would have these fantastical stories, or medrash that would have from the Talmud, there were stories in the Talmud. They would be dismissed by many scholars. Say, this isn't scholarship; these are stories, these are fantastical explanations, and they're not to be taken literally. And he defended them, and he said they're part of Torah, they're part of our tradition, and this is something that actually, till today, is a very important part of Judaism, where we take all these things very seriously. Now, as far as literalism goes, he gave an example. For example, the Torah says that the Midrash says that Moses was 10 amos tall, which would be 15 or 18 feet tall, very tall. And he explained that actually it is literal, that Moses was 15 feet tall as the real Moses. And his idea was the real Moses wasn't the physical Moses. The real Moses is the Moses' soul, his essence, that he had this spirituality to him that made him tall, and therefore Moses may not have been, in reality, not have been 15 or 18 feet tall, but he was definitely above average height. But in other words, he viewed it the other way around. Instead of saying like, well, really Moses wasn't that tall, he's like, no, really Moses was that tall. You just weren't able to perceive it because Moses was then constricted by a physical form, a physical body. So his soul and his identity was that, and he explains what that means kabbalistically, spiritually, mystically, etc. He also, part of his thought, he also discusses the Exodus, that the Exodus was a existential change, a mind shift, paradigm shift of people. There was no such thing as freedom previously to the Exodus from Egypt, and that the human nature to wanting to be free was born through that process. And he also discussed Galus, the Jewish exile, and how long it has been, and how it is unnatural, and how God really wants to bring the redemption. So that was also part of his thought. As far as his writings go, we mentioned the Beragola. He also wrote his magnum opus, was considered his magnum opus, is the book called Gur Aryeh, which literally means the lion's cub, and again based on the verse pertaining to the name of Yehudah, which was his name. And it's a commentary on Rashi's commentary on the Torah, and which we mentioned previously, that was his ancestor. So he wrote an entire commentary on that, and it's considered a very authoritative, important work. He wrote on the Haggadah. He wrote on, like we mentioned earlier, on the exile. He wrote on the greatness of Torah. He wrote on the laws of Hanukkah. He wrote about all kinds of different things. He also wrote a lot of his sermons, became books onto their own. Now, a video about the Maharal of Prague is not complete, of course, without talking about the Golem. The Golem is essentially, it means a humanoid. It's a person who is created by people using Kabbalistic ideas. This idea is brought in the Kabbalistic writings of Sefer Yetzirah and others, and the Maharal does not ever write that he had a golem or used a golem. But again, the legend goes that he did. Again, this is part of his fight against, apparently, his fight against oppression of the Jewish people, specifically the blood libel. Apparently, he had a relationship with Emperor Rudolf, who was the emperor of that area of Prague. Apparently, they discussed these things, and again, the church had a lot of power and was trying to push this narrative that Jewish people were using Christian blood for matzah, etc. So, in part of his fight against this Jewish persecution, he created this humanoid using Kabbalistic ideas. Now, in his writings, like we said, he never discusses having done it. He does discuss the idea that this is not. In his writings, he discusses how he does not view this as a big deal. In the Talmud, it discusses rabbis in the Talmud who would create every before Shabbat, they would create a calf using these Kabbalistic ideas in Sefer Yetzirah, and they would slaughter and eat it every Shabbat. So he felt that this was not a big deal. Obviously, for us, creating a humanoid out of clay would be considered pretty cool, pretty radical. But he did not view it Kabbalistically or spiritually, or however you want to view it practically. He didn't view it as a big deal. So that we do have from his writings. It's not mentioned till much later by people writing about the legend of the Golem. Now, the story essentially goes that he created this golem, and the synagogue that he was the rabbi of, the Altanai Shul, which literally means the old new synagogue. It was a synagogue. It still extant today, which amazingly. And apparently, I think if I understand correctly, the synagogue was like a merger of two synagogues. So it was like the old and the new, the Altanai Shul. And it's still, you can visit it till today. It's in Prague. And there was an attic where you could see where the attic was. And after the golem finished his job, it was laid to rest in this attic and eventually sealed off. Apparently, the attic, they had used it for Shemus, for collecting old, Jewish prayer books or, Jewish items that have to eventually be buried. They apparently stored it in this attic, and he was buried underneath there. Nobody was ever allowed to go into the attic. However, there is a story that the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, did once go to Prague. He bribed a guard to allow him to ascend the attic. That is the story. His father, Rabbi Shalom Dovber, the fifth Chabad Rebbe, he did mention that this was that he had to spiritually do something to make sure this didn't affect him, and that is all we have from him. Later, the Lubavitcher Rebbe said that he heard from his father-in-law that he did see the golem, and therefore he put aside, in his view, based on his father-in-law's testimony, the previous Rebbe's testimony that he had seen the golem himself, or the remains of the golem, I guess you could say, that the golem was a real thing that the Maharal created. I should mention, by the way, that the Lubavitcher Rebbes are all descendant of the Maharal of Prague, as we'll talk about in 1 second. And so, therefore, in the Lubavitcher Rebbe's view, again, many scholars will debate this, and I would say that definitely a lot of the stories about the golem are probably more myth than truth, just because of the fact they were not written by the Maharal himself, and they don't appear until maybe 100 or 200 years after his passing. So hard to say that the stories specifically about the golem are true, but the fact that the golem existed, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's view is very clear that the golem did exist. And again, in the Maharal's view, it would not be such a big deal. Now let's go on to his legacy. The legacy of the Maharal, of course, is his teachings. It's not about the golem. People think that the legacy of the Maharal is the golem. The golem, as we said, in his view, was not a big deal and was not. Obviously, if it did exist, and as the Rebbe said, it does exist. It did exist. He used it to help the Jewish people. That is something that is his legacy. His legacy of trying to help the Jewish people, and his writings, his Torah teachings that lasted generations. His direct descendant, the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneer Zalman of Liadi, which we discussed in a previous video, was a direct descendant about 7 or 8 generations from the Maharal. And in his magnum opus, the Tanya, if you open up the introduction, he says that he got these ideas of the Tanya, of Likutei Amarim Tanya, which is the foundational book of Hasidic thought. He says that he got this from Mipi Sfarim or Mipi Soifrim, which means from books and scholars. We'll just use that word. And the tradition is the books refer to the Maharal, and the other book will be the Shalah, which we'll discuss in the coming video. So, and of course, like we said, that so much of Chabad thought is built, and Hasidic thought is built on the teachings of the Maharal, his Kabbalistic teachings. So the Maharal's, again, his legacy is really about his Torah teachings, his fight to protect the Jewish people from persecution, and he's, of course, at least the legendary creator of the Golem. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, comments, you think I made a mistake, something I said, something I should have said, could have said, let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video.